The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions. February 1945 brought another dawn to a small volcanic island. 8 square miles of black rock sat like a wound in the vast blue waters. Sulfur fumes rose from cracks in the earth. The Japanese called this place Iwo Jima. Steam lifted from the island's tortured surface as morning light touched the volcanic slopes. Beneath the smoke and sulfur lay something unprecedented. Over 20,000 Japanese soldiers waited in positions carved from rock harder than steel. They had spent months preparing for what was coming. One experienced colonel had studied American tactics across every Pacific battle. He understood how Sherman tanks struggled against fortified positions. Machine gun fire from hidden caves had stopped entire American advances. When reports reached him about approaching enemy armor, survivors later recalled his reaction. He laughed at the news. The metal boxes would find only death in his prepared positions. Caves and tunnels would swallow them completely. This unnamed officer represented countless Japanese commanders who underestimated American adaptability. What approached his defensive network would revolutionize warfare itself. These were not ordinary tanks rolling toward his carefully mapped killing fields. Something entirely different was coming ashore. Sherman tanks that carried liquid fire instead of explosive shells. Dragons made of steel that breathed flames hot enough to melt stone. The strategic importance of this desolate island cannot be overstated. American B-29 superfortresses were already devastating Japanese cities from bases in the Mariana Islands. But a critical problem threatened the entire bombing campaign. Iwo Jima sat directly between American air bases and Japan itself. Japanese fighters launched from the island's airstrips to intercept bomber formations. Radar installations provided hours of advance warning to the homeland. Damaged B-29s returning from missions had nowhere to make emergency landings. Many crews disappeared forever into the cold Pacific waters. The mathematics of strategy were brutally simple. Capture this volcanic rock and American bombers could fly with fighter escorts to Japan's doorstep. Leave it in enemy hands, and the bombing campaign would remain crippled. For American planners, Iwo Jima was the key to victory itself. Japanese defenders understood the stakes equally well. This island represented the final barrier protecting their homeland. If Iwo Jima fell, American medium bombers would join the B-29s in destroying Japanese cities. Military necessity merged with the desperate need to protect millions of civilians already dying in the firebombing campaign. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived to command the island's defense in June 1944. Unlike many Japanese officers, he had lived in the United States before the war. His understanding of American industrial power was deeply personal and frightening. In letters to his wife, Kuribayashi wrote with prophetic clarity, "America was the last nation on earth Japan should fight. Yet duty demanded he use that knowledge to create the most effective island defense in Pacific War history. He would transform his understanding of American capabilities into a nightmare for the approaching invasion force." The general found 8 square miles of volcanic moonscape when he reached Iwo Jima. Sulfur pits bubbled with toxic gases. Black beaches would make any amphibious assault a bloodbath. But Kuribayashi saw opportunity in this hellish landscape. Breaking with traditional Japanese doctrine that emphasized beach defenses and suicide charges, he ordered his men to dig. They dug for months without stopping. Japanese engineers carved an underground city from the volcanic rock itself. The island became honeycombed with mutually supporting defensive positions connected by interior tunnels. 11 miles of reinforced concrete tunnels snaked beneath Iwo Jima by the time American forces arrived. This was military engineering on a scale never before attempted. Command bunkers connected to ammunition storage areas. Firing positions supported each other with interlocking fields of death. The volcanic rock became armor protecting Japanese positions from the heaviest bombardment. Above ground, Kuribayashi positioned his weapons with scientific precision. Every square inch of beach and interior terrain was mapped and registered for artillery fire. Machine gun nests were camouflaged so perfectly that American reconnaissance failed to detect most positions. Anti-tank guns created killing fields where enemy armor would be channeled into predetermined ambushes. The defensive strategy represented a revolution in Japanese military thinking. No wasteful banzai charges would throw away precious lives. Every soldier would fight from fortified positions until death claimed him. Each defender was expected to kill 10 Americans before dying. While Japanese forces burrowed deeper into Iwo Jima's volcanic heart, American military planners wrestled with their own challenges. How could they rout defenders from positions that seemed immune to conventional weapons? Pacific battles of 1944 had taught brutal lessons about fighting Japanese defenders in fortified caves. Standard infantry tactics proved horrifically expensive in American lives. Machine gun fire from concrete bunkers pinned down entire companies for days. Artillery shells bounced harmlessly off reinforced positions. Even direct hits from battleship guns sometimes failed to penetrate cave entrances engineered to deflect explosive force. American commanders realized the answer lay in a weapon that could reach into these positions where explosive shells could not. Fire would flush out defenders who could survive conventional bombardment. Portable flamethrowers already proved their psychological effectiveness against Japanese soldiers, renowned for fighting to the death. But portable flame units carried a deadly price. Marines wielding flamethrowers survived an average of 4 minutes in combat. Bright orange flames made operators prime targets for enemy snipers. Bulky equipment made them slow-moving targets for concentrated fire. Casualty rates for flamethrower operators reached 92%. A different solution was desperately needed. That answer emerged from an unlikely source. A top-secret unit at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii worked under Colonel Unmacht of the Army Chemical Warfare Service. His team combined the best features of 3 different flame units to create something the Pacific War had never witnessed. 8 M4A3 Sherman medium tanks were selected for complete transformation. These were not simple modifications, but total conversions requiring extraordinary engineering. Installation demanded 150 pounds of welding rod and 1,100 electrical connections. Each conversion cost $20,000, equivalent to nearly $300,000 today. The result was the CBH-101 flamethrower system, later improved to the CBH-2. To 2 variant, these systems operated at 300 pounds per square inch pressure, giving them a range of 450 feet. Instead of 75mm guns, these Shermans carried pressurized tanks filled with napalm that would stick to anything and burn at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Marines developed various nicknames for these mechanical dragons. Officially designated M4A3R5 tanks, frontline troops called them Mark Is. More colorfully, they became known as Zippo tanks after the popular cigarette lighter, or Ronsons, referencing the flamethrower component manufacturer. Both sides prepared for the coming battle with grim determination. Japanese forces had spent 8 months turning Iwo Jima into what they believed was an impregnable fortress. American forces assembled the largest amphibious assault force in Marine Corps history. Over 70,000 Marines, supported by hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft, prepared for the assault. 3 days of preliminary bombardment preceded the landings. American battleships pounded Iwo Jima with the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment in Pacific War history. Battleships Tennessee and Idaho moved within 2,500 yards to pulverize Japanese positions. The bombardment reportedly caused more damage in one day than months of air attacks. Yet when the smoke cleared, American commanders discovered with dismay that most Japanese positions remained intact. Volcanic rock absorbed punishment that would have pulverized conventional fortifications. Unknown to the Americans, most of Kuribayashi's forces waited safely in their underground city for the moment when invaders would be most vulnerable. The 8 flame tanks loaded aboard LST landing ships with conventional armor and other equipment. All flame tanks landed on D-Day and entered combat on D+2, initially used sparingly while crews gained battle experience. No amount of training could prepare them for what awaited on Iwo Jima's volcanic beaches. Japanese forces referred to these new weapons as M1 tanks, possibly due to poor translation of MH1 designations. This minor translation error would prove prophetic. Japanese defenders had no real understanding of what these American innovations could accomplish against their carefully prepared positions. At 900 hours on February 19, 1945, the first wave of Marine assault troops struck Iwo Jima's beaches. For nearly an hour, the landing proceeded with surprising ease. Marines scrambled ashore, established initial positions, and began moving inland. Some optimistic observers wondered if intensive bombardment had finally broken Japanese resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. At approximately 1,000 hours, the volcanic island erupted with concentrated death. Hidden positions that had remained silent during bombardment suddenly opened fire with devastating effect. Machine guns, mortars, artillery pieces, and rifles concentrated fire on crowded beaches where Marines and equipment were packed in deadly confusion. The nature of volcanic sand created additional nightmares for American forces. The beaches proved nearly impossible to dig into, leaving Marines exposed to murderous fire from hidden positions. Black volcanic sand made it almost impossible for troops to run or seek cover effectively. Tanks and vehicles became bogged down in unstable terrain, creating traffic jams at the waterline. Perfect targets for Japanese gunners who had spent months calculating range and elevation for every square yard of beach. As night fell on February 19th, Marines expected to be moving inland found themselves clinging to a narrow strip of volcanic beach. Private Jim Norton of the 3rd Battalion, 28th Marines, captured the mood perfectly. Nobody talked. God only knew what lay ahead of them. In their caves and bunkers, Japanese defenders waited for traditional banzai charge signals that never came. Kuribayashi's innovative strategy was working exactly as planned. Instead of wasteful frontal attacks, his forces would bleed Americans slowly, position by position, cave by cave. But Japanese defenders had not accounted for what was coming ashore with subsequent waves of American forces. Hidden among conventional Sherman tanks were 8 vehicles that would change everything. February 21, 1945. D+2 in the brutal arithmetic of amphibious warfare. Marine infantry had spent 2 days clawing their way inland, paying in blood for every yard of volcanic rock. Conventional weapons proved frustratingly ineffective against Japanese positions that materialized from the island itself to pour death on advancing Marines, then vanished back into the rock. Time had come to unleash the dragons. The first flamethrower tank moved forward under cover of smoke and supporting infantry. Its target was a seemingly innocent rise in volcanic landscape that had been spitting machine gun fire at advancing Marines for hours. Japanese gunners in the hidden position had beaten back 3 separate infantry assaults. What happened next was unlike anything the Pacific War had witnessed. Instead of the sharp crack of high-velocity guns, the Sherman's turret emitted a low mechanical hiss. Then, with a sound like tearing silk, a stream of liquid fire arced through the air. Jellied gasoline, pressurized to 300 pounds per square inch, shot nearly 400 feet, far beyond the range of portable flamethrowers. Napalm struck the cave entrance and splashed inside like burning water. But this was not ordinary fire. Napalm burned at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit and stuck to everything it touched: stone, metal, flesh. Everything became fuel for hungry flames. Worse for defenders, napalm consumed oxygen at voracious rates. Japanese soldiers who were not burned often suffocated as flames devoured breathable air in confined positions. The effect on Japanese defenders was immediate and terrifying. According to 1st Marine Division history, this was the one weapon that caused Japanese soldiers to leave their caves and rock crevices and run. Men trained from childhood to die before surrendering, who had proven their willingness to fight to death in countless Pacific battles, were breaking and running from positions they had held against conventional weapons for days. For Marines watching this demonstration, it was like witnessing dragons brought to life. Here was a weapon that could reach into the very heart of Japanese fortifications and make them uninhabitable. Word spread quickly through the ranks. The flame tanks worked. Once their effectiveness became clear, Marines held off advances until flamethrower tanks could be brought forward to support attacks. But Japanese forces were not passive observers of this new threat. If conventional weapons could not stop these fire-breathing monsters, they would have to find other ways to counter them. Success of the first flamethrower tank operations sent shockwaves through Japanese defensive positions across Iwo Jima. Radio communications crackled with reports that defied belief. American tanks were breathing fire, burning out positions that had withstood direct hits from naval guns and aerial bombs. Cave systems that had taken months to construct were being rendered uninhabitable in minutes. In his final radio transmission to Japanese military headquarters, General Kuribayashi would later acknowledge this new reality. He found comfort seeing his officers and men die without regret after struggling in inch-by-inch battle against overwhelming enemy forces with many tanks, exposed to indescribable bombardments. Japanese response was swift and desperate. They had faced American armor before and developed effective countermeasures. Magnetic mines could be attached to tank hulls, satchel charges thrown by soldiers willing to sacrifice their lives, carefully positioned anti-tank guns that could disable conventional Shermans. But flamethrower tanks presented unique challenges. Unlike conventional tanks that had to close within a few hundred yards to be effective, these fire-breathing monsters could kill from nearly 400 feet away. Japanese defenders attempting to rush them with explosive charges found themselves incinerated before they could get close enough to attach their weapons. Sherman tanks were difficult to disable, often requiring Japanese defenders to assault them in open ground, where they were vulnerable to superior numbers and firepower of supporting Marines. Japanese response became increasingly desperate as more flame tanks entered battle. Suicide attacks, already a hallmark of Japanese defensive tactics, intensified dramatically. Individual soldiers attempted to rush flame tanks with explosives strapped to their bodies, knowing they faced certain death, but hoping to destroy these mechanical demons before they could burn out more positions. Some Japanese units tried different approaches. Concentrated anti-tank gunfire aimed at pressurized napalm tanks mounted on Shermans. A successful hit on these fuel systems could theoretically turn the flame tank into a massive fireball, destroying both vehicle and nearby American forces. But tanks had been carefully armored, and hitting such specific targets under combat conditions proved nearly impossible. More tragic were attempts by Japanese soldiers to fight fire with fire. Some defenders tried creating improvised flamethrowers using captured gasoline and improvised ignition systems. These desperate weapons were crude, dangerous to operators, and completely ineffective against armored flame tanks that continued their methodical destruction of Japanese positions. Behind statistics and tactical innovations were human beings caught in one of warfare's most brutal crucibles. For American Marines, flamethrower tanks represented salvation, weapons that could finally overcome Japanese defenses that had seemed impregnable. But operating these mechanical dragons came with psychological burdens. Tank crews trained to fire high-explosive shells at distant targets now found themselves burning human beings alive at close range. Napalm they dispensed did not discriminate between hardened positions and desperate men defending them. Crew members would later describe haunting screams emerging from caves as their liquid fire did its work. Sounds that would follow many for the rest of their lives. For Marines following behind flame tanks, the weapons were godsends that saved countless American lives. As one company commander observed, in his view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. Marines who had watched friends die in futile assaults on Japanese positions now saw those same positions neutralized in minutes by fire-breathing Shermans. Psychological impact extended beyond immediate battlefield effectiveness. Japanese defenders trained from childhood that death was preferable to surrender found their resolve tested by this new weapon. Many would later describe terror of facing liquid fire that could reach them even in deepest bunkers. Some chose death by their own hand rather than face flames. Others, breaking with centuries of military tradition, actually emerged from positions with hands raised in surrender. More poignant are personal accounts from both sides that emerged after the war. One Japanese soldier, writing decades later, described watching a flame tank approach his position. They had faced American shells and bombs for days. They were prepared to die fighting. But when that metal dragon breathed fire into their cave, something inside them broke. The fire was alive, hunting them in darkness where they thought they were safe. An American Marine who served as infantry support for flame tanks wrote that you could not help but feel sorry for Japanese soldiers, even though they had been trying to kill Americans for weeks. Nobody deserved to die like that. But they had tried everything else, and this was the only thing that worked. By the first week of March 1945, flamethrower tanks had fundamentally altered the character of battle for Iwo Jima. What had begun as slow, grinding advance measured in yards per day was accelerating into systematic destruction of Japanese defensive positions. Marines developed what they called the corkscrew and blowtorch tactic. Conventional Sherman tanks would first engage Japanese positions with high-explosive shells, cracking open bunkers and cave entrances. Then flamethrower tanks would move forward to douse interiors with burning napalm, ensuring that any defenders who had survived initial bombardment would be eliminated or forced to abandon positions. This methodical approach proved devastatingly effective. Since each tank battalion had only 4 flame tanks, they were pulled between units and dispatched from refueling locations as battle progressed. Marines became so dependent on flame tanks that they would hold up assaults until flame tanks were available to support attacks. Napalm consumption became staggering. Toward battle's end, 5th Marine tanks expended between 5,000 to 10,000 gallons of napalm per day. 8 original flamethrower tanks were consuming approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm every day of battle, turning square miles of volcanic rock into hellscapes of burned-out positions and charred stone. For Japanese defenders, psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. Positions that had seemed impregnable just days before were being systematically eliminated. The careful defensive network that Kuribayashi had spent months constructing was being unraveled by weapons that could reach into deepest caves and bunkers. As March progressed, Japanese defense of Iwo Jima entered its final phase. The northern part of the island, with its complex terrain and strongest fortifications, became the site of most brutal fighting. Here, in areas Marines grimly nicknamed the Meat Grinder and Bloody Gorge, last major Japanese defensive positions made their stand. Even as defeat became inevitable, General Kuribayashi maintained his innovative defensive strategy. Instead of ordering traditional mass banzai attack that would have resulted in quicker annihilation of remaining forces, he continued his policy of extracting maximum casualties from every position. Each cave, each bunker, each defensive position would be held until flame tanks made them uninhabitable. Flamethrower tanks proved their worth in these final battles more than anywhere else. Rocky terrain vastly favored defense, even more than Mount Suribachi, which was much more vulnerable to naval artillery fire. Fortifications on northern section of Iwo Jima were also more impressive than those at southern end. Conventional weapons made little impact on these positions, but mechanical dragons continued their deadly work. One of the most poignant moments of the final phase came when American forces discovered that some Japanese positions had been abandoned, not because of direct flame attacks, but because defenders had seen what happened to neighboring positions and chose to retreat rather than face fire. This represented a fundamental break in Japanese military psychology. For the first time in Pacific War, significant numbers of Japanese soldiers were withdrawing from positions rather than fighting to death. Yet even in retreat, many Japanese soldiers maintained their honor and dedication. Some moved to new positions where they continued fighting. Others, unable to bear shame of withdrawal, took their own lives according to traditional military code. Complex emotions and cultural pressures faced by Japanese defenders during these final days reflected broader tragedy of a war that had consumed entire nations. By March 26th, organized Japanese resistance had finally ended. General Kuribayashi, who had transformed this volcanic island into the most effective defensive position in Pacific War history, was believed to have died leading a final night attack on American positions. His body was never identified, but his legacy was undeniable. He had turned what American planners expected to be a 5-day battle into a 36-day nightmare that cost nearly 7,000 American lives. When smoke finally cleared over Iwo Jima on March 26, 1945, statistics told a story of unprecedented carnage. Nearly 7,000 Americans had been killed, with another 20,000 wounded. Of 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died fighting, often in positions that had been burned out by flamethrower attacks. Effectiveness of flame tanks had proven so decisive that military planners immediately began expanding the program. Another 72 tanks were ordered by Marine Corps for the planned invasion of Japan, of which 70 were ready by victory over Japan Day. Military gave these weapons AAA procurement priority, the same given to B-29 Super Fortress and Manhattan Project. For crews who operated these mechanical dragons, the battle had been a transformative experience. They had proven that innovation and determination could overcome even the most formidable defenses. Tank commanders reported that psychological impact of flame tanks often exceeded their direct destructive effect. Japanese defenders would frequently abandon positions after seeing neighboring caves burned out, even if their own positions had not been directly attacked. Broader strategic implications were equally significant. Capture of Iwo Jima provided exactly what American planners had hoped for: emergency landing fields for damaged B-29s and fighter bases to escort bombing missions over Japan. During remaining months of war, Over 2,400 B-29s made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, potentially saving lives of 27,000 American airmen. But victory had come at terrible cost. Battle of Iwo Jima remains to this day the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history and the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese losses. Ferocity of fighting shocked American military planners and the public, raising serious questions about projected casualties for planned invasion of Japan itself. Flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima represented more than just tactical innovation. They symbolized industrial and technological superiority that would ultimately determine outcome of Pacific War. Where Japanese defenders had relied on natural defenses and human courage, American forces had responded with mechanical ingenuity and overwhelming material resources. Psychological impact of flame tanks extended far beyond their immediate battlefield effectiveness. Japanese military leadership, already grappling with implications of American industrial might, now faced reality that their most effective defensive tactics could be countered by American innovation. Implications for planned defense of Japanese home islands were sobering. For American forces, flame tanks provided a template for future operations. When Marines landed on Okinawa in April 1945, flamethrower tanks were integral to assault plans from the beginning. Lessons learned from volcanic caves of Iwo Jima proved invaluable in complex cave systems and fortified positions of Japan's final outer defense. Human stories that emerged from Iwo Jima also contributed to more nuanced understanding of warfare in Pacific. American veterans spoke with respect about Japanese courage and determination, even as they acknowledged necessity of weapons that had broken that resistance. Japanese survivors, in rare post-war accounts, expressed grudging admiration for American technical innovation while mourning loss of so many dedicated defenders. Perhaps most significantly, flame tanks of Iwo Jima demonstrated the double-edged nature of military innovation. They had undoubtedly saved thousands of American lives by making Japanese positions untenable without costly infantry assaults. Yet, they had also introduced new level of horror to warfare, forcing human beings to confront death by fire in some of the most terrifying circumstances imaginable. Today, Iwo Jima stands as a monument to both American determination and Japanese sacrifice. The volcanic island that once echoed with roar of flame tanks and screams of dying men is now quiet, its caves sealed, its battlefields grown over with slow healing of time. Visitors to the island can still see scars left by battle. Craters from naval bombardment, remains of Japanese bunkers, black and stone where napalm did its deadly work. These physical reminders tell story of 36 days that changed nature of warfare and hastened end of Pacific War. The unnamed Japanese colonel, who reportedly laughed at approaching American tanks, represents more than just one man's miscalculation. He symbolizes tragic reality that in warfare, yesterday's certainties become tomorrow's vulnerabilities. Caves and tunnels that had seemed impregnable became death traps when faced with weapons that could turn stone shelters into ovens. For American Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, flamethrower tanks provided the key to unlock Japanese defenses that had seemed impossible to overcome. But victory came at a price that would influence American military thinking for generations. Casualties suffered in taking one small volcanic island raised profound questions about cost of invading Japan itself. Questions that would ultimately contribute to decision to use atomic weapons rather than risk massive casualties that conventional invasion seemed to promise. Dragons that breathed fire on Iwo Jima had proven their deadly effectiveness. But in doing so, they had also demonstrated that even most innovative weapons come with moral burden that extends far beyond battlefield. Young Americans who operated those flame tanks, Japanese soldiers who faced them, and nations that sent them to fight had all been changed by the experience. In the end, story of flamethrower tanks at Iwo Jima reminds us that warfare's technological evolution is also a human story, one of innovation and courage, of desperation and sacrifice, of victories that come at prices that can never be fully calculated. Laughter of one Japanese colonel died in flames of liquid fire, but echoes of that 36-day battle continue to resonate through military history and human memory. Dragons had awakened, done their terrible work, and changed warfare forever. Price of that change was measured not just in gallons of napalm or square miles of burned stone, but in thousands of young men who never returned home from a volcanic island whose name means Sulphur Island in Japanese, but which Marines would forever remember as place where American innovation met Japanese determination in one of most brutal battles in human history.